Ave Dominus Nox. These three words breathed through the vox grill of a helmet are often followed by the countless deaths of basically every species that has walked the galaxy. Words that convey not just intent, but have taken on the meaning of defiance in the face of what many would consider a path to damnation that no rational being could follow. These words reject any notion of chivalry, any notion of obedience, any notion of decency or loyalty to anyone other than themselves. These words are counter to what it means to be a space marine, where some and their cousin legions try to maintain some sort of chivalry, some menial sense of loyalty or common purpose in the name of gods that use them just as often as they fight one another. The 8th Legion needs no such power to make someone bleed for an eternity of violence only they know how to create. Weapons of war are not meant to have a purpose past what they can find for themselves, and to say anything otherwise to the delusional creatures that call themselves Traitor Astartes is a fool's errand at best, and a waste of time for those who see no need to justify their existence to anyone. During the Unification Wars, the Emperor of Mankind needed weapons, soldiers to serve a purpose that only in the grand scheme he could understand. Some of these were more noble, others savage, but within that spectrum of application there always comes the lessons and forces that act in ways that people only discuss behind closed doors and in hushed tones. The type of warriors that exist not only to pacify, but are a threat by the nature of their existence. The Emperor decided that his 8th Legion would serve that role, drawn from the dregs of the worst parts of human civilization, from places where the crude justice of knives glinting in the dark was the only constant. These children who knew no sun or fresh air would be the candidates for his Legion of Torment. Their lives and where they came from followed them wherever they roamed, as the pale-eyed monsters with greasy black hair clad in armor of the previous Thunder Warriors would stalk and pacify every city, population, and individual the Emperor saw as a threat. You see, unlike many of the other legions during the Unification Wars, the 8th were always designed to be weapons, to be tools of fear, trained in psychological warfare, to bleed and neutralize a population until it could do nothing but cry in the soil drenched in the corpses of their loved ones, until they finally gave in. These crimes against living things were not done for pleasure, not done for some sadistic sense of justice, but because that was the war they were taught to fight. The first had their methods, as did the 9th. But the 8th Legion, like the other legions pre their Gene Father's influence, were all equally as barbaric and monstrous as each other. It just so happens that many legions would get a role model, a way out of that lifestyle, to achieve a supposed higher purpose. But the 8th had no such luck. As far off amongst the stars was a man waging his own war, a man who, whether he knew it then, was the perfect man to lead his legion of butchers, as like his sons he was raised in the same hell that they would go on to call home. That man was Konrad Curze, the Night Haunter. The world of Nostromo is quite possibly the most lawless and decadent land a human society can create. A world bathed in darkness, the type of darkness that you can't see 5 feet in front of your face. The type of society in place where your worst nightmare is someone's favorite daydream. A world that is defined by violence, ruled with an iron fist by gangs and murderers. A planet so dangerous that many would prefer death to ever setting foot on the world. In the darkest pits of the lawless world, the Night Hunter stalked, eating rats and fighting for his life every day, seeing the worst humanity could do to each other as he began to mature and grow like all Primarchs do. As his frame fills out and his gargantuan size began to set in, he would begin to take action. After years of the worst poverty and no place to call home, he would attack those that would terrorize the world with the weapon that they were so adept at using. Fear. Fear of not just retribution, but of the man clad in black, who to many was little more than a legend until he towered over you, his wicked smile draped in his black long hair as his black eyes bored his way into your very soul as you scream and scream for help. But nobody can save you when the violence of a man who was bred for it finally catches up to you. For years, he would do the same thing. Terrorize criminals, mutilate them beyond all recognition, and put them on display like paintings on a wall, stringing corpses up on buildings, rows and rows of beheaded men and women, their crimes carved into their bodies, terrifying not only those that he was trying to hurt, but scarring those he was attempting to save. He would even go as far to broadcast his torment all over the world. The endless screams and agony of those who had turned the world into an urban hell, seen by the eyes of every man, woman, and child who regretted to call Nostromo home. He was a monster, one that believed only he could bring rule to a world that knew none. For many years after his pacification of Nostromo, he would rule as a king, teaching nothing but fear to the populace that stayed in line due to his presence. And this is how it would have stayed, if not for the arrival of his true father. On the fateful day, the Emperor and his brothers came to take him home. Instead of finding peace, he just found more pain. When gazing upon his brothers and his father, he would fall to his knees, screaming in agony as horrid visions of death and violence would flood his mind. Visions of the deaths of his brothers and a future to come that he did not fully understand. However, the Emperor, seeing his son's plight, would treat him with kindness. "Konrad Curze," he said, "be at peace, for I have arrived, and I intend to take you home." The Night Haunter, hearing his new name, scoffed at this, replying, "That is not my name, father. I am the Night Haunter, and I know full well what you intend for me." The newly ascended Primarch would reunite with his sons, in hearing of their history and of their methods, and finally felt somewhat at home alongside those that shared not only his preferred methods of war, but his contempt as well. Curze would begin to teach his sons, teach of his view of justice, of violence, and of his ideas of the necessary extremes to bring compliance to people that did not deserve pacification, only violence to keep fools in line. The Legion loved this. The new culture, the new, more barbaric yet satisfying form of warfare made them even more brutal. The harvesting of trophies, of skins, and bones to create a terrifying visage would become a very common practice. The custom patterns of armor designed to terrify as much as they protected the user. The look this conveyed was sheer psychological warfare, the apex and true intent of what their Legion was designed for. The visage of a hulking midnight blue monster, with glowing red eyes adorned with the flesh and blood of its victims, would be the last image any non-compliant world would see if they were as unlucky to feel the wrath of the 8th Legion. This change in the Legion made many feel a sense of vindication. After years and years of their cousin Legions and their Primarchs objecting to their methods, despite committing atrocities alongside those same cousins, far before they changed when their Primarch decided it was not proper or fair. Fairness was never their mission, only blood, and blood would come in ample supply, as the Great Crusade gave Curze and his legions such a canvas to create on, such worlds to conquer, such fear to spread, such justice for those who knew none. Bolstered with the best Nostroman recruits the world had to offer, they would run rampant. But as time would pass, more and more times the same question would come. Is this necessary? Time and time again, the arguments would come, but the Legion's reasoning would stay the same, while the other Legions decided that conquering and exterminating entire populations for supposed deviancy was a good idea, wasting human lives and resources on campaigns that lasted for years. It only took the 8th Legion to punish those that stood before them to secure compliance. They do not need to rebuild. They do not need a last stand, and they certainly do not need some savage king telling them how to be noble when their feral mutated sons were the only Legion requiring glorified babysitters to keep them all in line. Only a few lives taken, only a fraction of the population would suffice, and while everyone else was wasting time, it took only the screams of the royal family, or an entire city beheaded, or the corpses of a world's greatest defending company dumped onto the front lawn of a monarch for them to see the futility of their defiance in the face of sheer, overwhelming power. These methods work, and to those who did not understand it, it was merely showing their weakness and lack of willingness to do what needs to be done. It does not matter whether or not Vulcan thinks they are barbarians, or if Korax finds their methods detestable. It does not matter to anyone other than themselves, because they are here to conquer. They are here to crusade. This is not a war of hearts and minds. Hearts and minds do not feel and think until ample consequences brought into the homes of those who resist the proper rule that they deserve. They were made to shock, to terrify. They were doing what they were made to do, and that is all. And despite the constant bickering and arguing, the Emperor stood by and let them be. He let them do what they did best. He believed in his son and in his Legion, and would let them continue to serve in a way that at the time was necessary. But that Legion that was formed from Terran and Nostroman blood would begin to falter and weaken as a poison would creep its way into the veins of the Legion. Nostromo began to rebel. not against the Imperium, but the rule of the Night Haunter that had long since left to find other worlds to pillage. The old gang families would rise up again, beginning to alter the recruitment processes and ship not well-trained or fitting recruits, but the same gangers and murderers that Curze spent his entire life on the planet skinning alive. Over time, he would see the change. Over time, new commanders would take the place of the old. Over time, crimes would begin to be committed on the battlefield, on their ships, and behind closed doors. Curze knew this. He foresaw it, like he began to see everything else that would crawl into his mind and leave him writhing on the floor in agony as the thoughts and visions of a nightmare yet to come would torment his already weakened mental state. Curze was not just a barbarian murderer clad in the armor of the gods. He was a witness to the universe's worst possible futures. In his mind, he would see what was to come. Horus, the end of the Crusade. Istvan, the end of the Golden Age of the Imperium. All the way until the beginnings of the 13th Black Crusade 10,000 years later. He saw all of it, and these visions, these manifestations of the living universe that tormented his mind, began to make Curze, for the first time in his life, truly afraid. And when that time got closer and closer, the visions would become clearer, more concrete, more real than anything he could possibly imagine. And during the campaign on Shrout, Curze would make a profound mistake. He would confide in his brother Fulgrim of his ailments, the visions, the fears he had for the future, and just broke down. If it was someone more understanding, someone more willing to listen, like Lorgar, Gilliman, or even the man that he was most jealous of, Corvus Corax, he could have gotten help, a listening ear, a kind but firm hand to help understand why this was happening. But Fulgrim never was that type of man, and when Rogel Dorn heard of the Night Haunter's words, he heard nothing more than treachery. And after being verbally berated by the 7th Legion's Primarch, Konrad, backed into a literal and metaphorical wall, would black out. And during this blackout, he would mercilessly attack Dorn, nearly killing him, the wounds being so grievous and savage that it would have made an Astartes, let alone a human, into paste. Konrad, after this, was imprisoned. His legion and himself were being taken back to Terra, their methods, their roles as warriors now being truly questioned by the Emperor that gave them their purpose. But it was here that Curze would finally know of Nostromo's turn. And after breaking out and reuniting with his fleet, the entire Legion would make way to their homeworld and would prepare to open fire. And while some ships followed orders and began to glass the anarchic planet, many would refuse, requiring the intervention of his most trusted captain Sevatar to personally intervene and make sure the Night Hunter's orders were followed. And now, without a home or a purpose, now that Curze and his Legion felt more isolated than ever, they began to do what they did best: torment. Many worlds would fall under fire from the Legion, the atrocities getting worse and worse as each story of the Legion would slowly make their way back to their cousins and to Terra. But while many would debate and discuss what to do about the now, in all actuality, rogue Legion, outright censure was never truly acted upon. Despite many calling for it, the Legion still had value, even in their most barbaric state. So it was ordered that supplies would be slowed, communications unanswered, and all support from non-Legion elements been recalled. Over time, the Legion would become more and more alone, and by the time of Istvan V, the internal attitude of the Legion had shifted, going from a Space Marine Legion, a standing army and everything that comes along with it, to that of renegades for the first time in their history. When Horus Lupercal would personally call the Legion to unite with him at Istvan, showing his evidence of the Emperor's plan to ascend as a god and his lies not only to his Legion, but to everyone else, the Night Lords needed no convincing in order to fall into place. Death to the false Emperor, a battle cry that wherever you go is uttered by every single traitor Legion and Chaos Loyalist, was uttered for the first time by Sevatar himself. Their methods would not change, nor their status as warriors, only the enemies they fight. Despite knowing that this was part of the future he so desperately wanted to stop, Curze found that this was the only place left for him and his Legion, that this was his only opportunity to be safe from the Emperor's wrath, even if it never truly came. Night Lords would assist the other traitors at Istvan V, Curze and his Legion decimating the Salamanders, even capturing the Primarch that hated him most, Vulcan. Curze was, for lack of a better term, elated to finally have a Primarch to experiment on, but despite his best attempts, and in a crude form of irony, Vulcan could never truly die, his status as a perpetual being unknown to Curze, and despite the pain that Vulcan felt being so excruciating and astronomical that it brought him to insanity several times, Vulcan never truly died, much to the anger of Konrad Curze. But this would not be the end for him or his legion, as his legion would take on the Dark Angels and their Primarch Lionel Johnson, engaging what would become to be known as the Thramas Crusade. For years, the two legions clashed, as countless civilians, auxilia, and whoever was in between dying over the course of the campaign. However, this was not meant to be, as after Konrad's second duel with the first Primarch, he would be grievously wounded and put into a coma. The Legion was left without a leader, unsure of whether or not to run or to hunt down the Dark Angels in a stand-up fight that they would most certainly lose. It was here that Sevatar would step forward and take command. Dividing the Legion into 6 different fleets, Sevatar realized that their greatest strength was not to fight a straight-up war like Horus had commanded. It was never their role. Their role now was to delay, to fight dirty, to sabotage and wreak absolute havoc on the Dark Angels or whoever they came across. Each fleet was left to do what they wished, and during the final organization of this new structure while Curze was recovering, the Dark Angels fleet would attack the remaining Night Lords, as those who elected to stay behind and head towards Terra separated from those who would go amongst the stars to whatever pasture they found suitable for them. Curze, despite his injuries, would wake up, and would order Sevatar and others to board the Dark Angels flagship, the Invincible Reason, in one last-ditch effort to kill the Lion. Sevatar obeyed, but this attempt would prove to be a failure, as Sevatar would be captured, and Konrad Curze would escape into the bowels of the ship, terrorizing its crew over the course of the next 6 months while the Legion headed for Ultramar. While Curze was on Macragge, giving the Lion, Guilliman, and Sanguinius a massive headache in regards to the atrocities it committed all over the planet, the rest of the Legion was left to do what it wished. Some would reunite with the larger traitor fleet heading towards Terra, those who fought in the battle fighting not as legionaries, but warriors fighting an enemy they just wanted to punish. But like the rest of the legions that were at Terra, they were unsuccessful, with some select few being able to flee, while the rest stayed behind and died alone as they continued to fight personal battles. But many did not leave for the Eye of Terror, instead residing within the eastern fringe of the galaxy, being the only major traitor forces still troubling the Imperium, as the rest would reside within the Eye for many years during the Scouring, and the Imperium would finally act to put the Legion and the Night Hunter down for good. Curze was not present at Terra. After his failures during his actions on Ultramar, he'd be captured and tried by the Primarchs of the Imperium Secundus, and was deemed that he would be frozen and placed into a capsule and set into deep space. For years, the Night Hunter would reside in his pod, unable to move or process when or where he was, until a lone salvage vessel found him and made the mistake of taking him in. One of the crew was in reality an acolyte of the Calidus Assassin Temple, who in his efforts to take out the now reawakened Primarch, let him loose, and despite his best efforts, he failed spectacularly, as like everyone else on the ship, except for a member of the crew named Elver, he would die. Curze, now left in the middle of space with nowhere to go, or anything to do, as the ship was not warp-capable, decided to make his way to the world of Seguelsa, a world that he chose as the Night Lord's new base of operations after Nostromo was destroyed. This is a journey that would take a very long time to get there in sublight speeds. Elver would fly the ship, and Curze would attempt to educate the man on his ideals. When they finally arrived, Curze would step foot onto the world. His new fortress, although incomplete, was suitable for what he needed. A few of his sons would meet him there. First Claw, led by Talos Valkorin, more commonly known as the Soul Hunter. Curze would give the remainder of his legion his final orders, imploring his sons to not avenge him when the Imperial assassin he foresaw coming would finally kill him. He spent his last days in his palace of sorts, constructing a macabre sculpture of the Emperor made out of the flesh of various victims, as he would ramble his life story to the effigy and wonder where he went wrong. And this is where it is very important to understand that Konrad Curze, like his legion, was cursed with the understanding of their purpose within the universe. The Legion had some idea, and still does, but Konrad knew it all. Whether it was fate or a self-fulfilled prophecy, he knew what was wanted for himself and his sons, but he kept that knowledge to himself until his dying day. He knew of what would happen to Talos in his eventual death, the war between the remainder of his legion and his traitor brothers, the horrid decadence and evil that those misguided sons who were left would commit. But he did not stop it. He did not try to change his path. He just watched idly by, paralyzed by a truth he never asked to see. Whether or not he could have saved his sons is up for debate. But what is known is that even if he tried, it was far too late. The only thing he wished he could have done was at the moment of his first meeting with the Emperor that he wished he would have rejected his father, rejected his calling, rejected his name that was not his own, rejecting all of it. For he was, and always would have been, the Knight Haunter. The man Konrad Curze was a mask, a false imprint of a man the Emperor hoped that would be real, a man that represented and betrayed the strength he had forsaken when he took the name presented to him and abandoned his true birthright. He had abandoned everything he held dear, and in the ashes and dreams of his failures, he would only realize that he didn't need to leave to find his home. He had it there with him, and the only time he ever returned was to turn it into ashen rock. To Konrad, there was nothing to be done. Not in his state. Not with the fear of the dark future that was laying siege to his mind day in and day out. The knowledge and visions that poisoned his mind for years. But his ambition to let loose the shackles of his destiny, what could vaguely be called ambition rather, more likely a mixture of regret and reflection, was only for a moment, as in his final days when going through his failures, after a hallucination or the presence of the Emperor, he would simultaneously get answers, and the one thing he needed to make sense of his life and his failures. Clarity. He was always part of the plan. The Night Haunter, Konrad Curze, whatever name you apply to him, had a role, had a purpose meddled with by the hands of the gods that damned the burgeoning Imperium and half of its sons. It was not his fault, not the Emperor's, just fate changing like it always does. His greatest failure was not clinging to the strands of fate that he believed to be the truth, but to be complacent and fearful of the future that he was projected. Whether he wanted it or not, he had his father's forgiveness. It was just up to him to accept it. But his delusion, his dogmatic loyalty to one book and thousands of volumes of the universe's potential failures and eventualities as an excuse to be what he was, that was his failure. That was his cross he chose to bear. He was never an instrument to witness the passage of time, but a force to determine its flow and the path it would take. It was only his fear and self-loathing that damned him, and him alone. In a sea of brothers damned through mistakes or circumstance, it was only Konrad Curze, the Night Haunter, that truly damned himself. And the greatest irony of all of this is that despite having a view into the future and the fabric of reality he felt himself enslaved to, the only person that could forgive him, the only person that could listen to what he was told versus projecting it all as lies, was always going to be himself. It was his guilt, his worldview, and his change into the monster he created versus the one he became that was his doing. But even in death, despite getting the answers he pleaded and begged for, he got the wrong message from the story he thought that was authored for himself. So on the day when the Imperial assassin M. Shen took his life, he stood mockingly, believing in the reality that he created in his mind. Clutching his badges of office and wearing the crown he made for himself, he would feel vindication in death for a universe that never reflected the fabric of the world he touched for days and days. And that misguided self-imposed fate would not just follow him into death, but the remaining sons that he left behind. His final orders were disobeyed, his sons forsaking the teachings and the last real words that meant anything for the sake of vengeance. Albeit by Talos, who did it for altruistic reasons, but despite that, they still disrespected their father's memory. But this pales in comparison to those who wanted to kill the assassin merely for the sake of stolen war gear, not altruism or vengeance, but just pointless greed. After this, the Legion would function in the way they had during the final parts of the Heresy War, as separate warbands, small, broken, and always on the verge of final collapse. The criminal element largely being the only ones left flying the flag of their Legion in any manner, as those who were disillusioned would either fall devoted to chaos or join the Black Legion in Abaddon's crusade. But despite no matter what they did, they were never truly part of the traitor fold, and no matter how much they were asked to help with the Black Crusade, and how much they ever contributed, they were never one with their cousin legions, just pure renegades. And in many ways, that is how they've always been. And something that is even more ironic is that out of all of the traitor legions, the Night Lords and Konrad Curze were the one legion to never truly realize their full purpose. That destiny, that potential, was taken from them by the father that feared that outcome so much. Unlike the rest of the traitors and even the loyalists, every other legion lived up to the ideal of what they were created to do. The Iron Warriors are still siege masters. The Black Legion are still masters of the coordinated, precise assault, like the Sons of Horus and Luna Wolves before them. But the Night Lords? They went from a legion of psychological warfare specialists to butchers. Even other legions that degraded into nearly unrecognizable states are still good at what they were made to do. The Night Lords lost that. They lost it when Curze was afraid of his own fate. They lost it when the Legion was poisoned by impure Nostraman recruits. Curze may have failed to see his own potential, but the Legion failed due to no fault of their own. They just put their trust in a man who did not know how to handle such a privilege. They are the one traitor Legion that has fallen below their true potential more than any other. Not because of their status as renegades, but due to their failure at being a legion of men following terror over justice when they were not supposed to. And even going as far back as the Great Crusade, the Night Lords were never truly bought into the fold of the Legiones Astartes. They were sometimes tolerated, other times hated, but even at the most accepting moments, they were always alone. Even if many like Sevatar were rightly considered some of the greatest Space Marines to have lived, what fate was going to be left for the Legion after the Great Crusade? What existence could they have had during a time of peace and prosperity? Like many of their brother traitor legions, the answer was extinction. Even for some of the most barbaric legions, there is an argument for their place in that type of society, the one the Emperor desired to create. But there is never going to be a place for the Night Lords after their work was done. Whether they were loyalists or traitors, they were never considered anything other than a weapon for temporary measure. They were always going to be abandoned by whatever master or fate that found the time to lead them. But what this did was give them the opportunity to forge their own destiny. Remember, they had no stake in the heresy. It was merely the side that would just so happen to protect them. Konrad and his sons always knew the unfortunate truth that their place in the universe had an expiration date. And past that, the only thing left for them was what they made for themselves. And whether it was a pirate, renegade, legion stalwart, or butcher, he who comes from the darkness of Nostromo must light their own fire, instead of following a torch that was always going to burn out. If you want to learn more about the Night Lords, I have several recommendations. The first up is the Night Lords trilogy. This is mandatory reading, not just for the Night Lords, but for 40k. I'm going to be honest, I did not read these books for a very long time. I was aware of how good they were, but the hype is real. They are as good as people say they are. So read the trilogy and the associated audio drama, read the short story The Dark King, the Konrad Curze Primarch novel, The Long Night, and the Prince of Crows novella. All of these are wonderful stories and are truly just excellent. There are not as many books about the Night Lords and really dive into them, but what is there is quality over quantity every time. Thank you all very much for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this video. I really enjoyed making it. This has honestly been some of the most fun I've had doing a research for a video, and keep in mind, I had a ton of fun doing research for the World Eaters and Word Bearers, but this takes the cake. Are the Night Lords my favorite Space Marine Legion? No, but I understand why so many people love them now, and I'm not gonna lie, they are absolutely fascinating. So, once again, thank you all very much for watching. I really do appreciate it. I thank you all very much for supporting the channel. If you'd like to consider becoming a member, please do. I really would appreciate it. And thank you very much to the members for supporting the channel. It means a lot to me. Thank you all very much for watching. Have a great night.